First of all, thank you to the organizer for having me here. It's a really pleasure to be in New York with you. So a bit of my background. So I was trained as an armchair philosopher, and as any respectable philosophers, I was obsessed with the problem of consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, subjectivity of our experiences. And I don't think I need to introduce to this crowd the famous knowledge argument, Mary, but there is something what it is like to see red, like a red tomato. Yeah. But me being from Burgundy, where we really like wines and food, my first thought was like, who cares about seeing a tomato? I mean, the most important thing is to eat the tomato, yeah? So, and to drink the tomato, yeah? So how about how the knowledge argument on what this likeness of experience would be for different senses, that vision, right? Like what you put inside the body, because you can't really survive without putting stuff inside the body, yeah? Like the wine. And sorry, Dave, I couldn't resist to add an extra slide, which is unrelated to the talk. It's about reality plus or reality minus. So I think a very important philosophical question is whether we can drink virtual wine or not, and what actually virtual reality can take away from us if we don't have like all the senses in the real world. But that was just like a parenthesis. Now, as I said, I was trained as a philosopher, but then I decided that I had an existential crisis after my PhD, and I said, do I really need to work on tomatoes for my entire life? I said no. So I moved to the empirical science. So I did training in cognitive neuroscience, and now I have my own lab where I basically investigate the same things, but with measures like psychophysiological, neural, phenomenological, computational, both in human and artificial agents. Yeah. And I did this for a couple of years in London before moving to Lisbon. And I was for 6 years in London. I was like the philosopher resident at the beginnings, and my job was to ask annoying philosophical questions that scientists really don't like. And one of the questions that I was asking all the time is just like, and actually I'm going to ask this question to you as well, look around you. Why don't you see babies in the room investigating consciousness? And when I was asking this question, my colleague scientists, they look at each other like this, puzzled. Said, I told you we shouldn't have a philosopher with us to ask all the silly question. What do you mean we don't have kids in the room to investigate? It's like, yeah, this is silly. But I don't think it's silly. I think it's important. Why? Because the important point I want to make is that when we start investigating things, we're already using certain conceptual lenses and tools that we have as adults. And that we should be aware of that lens that we use when we start to investigate ourselves, yeah, and the world. So this means that we might have. I want to argue. So you heard up to now, you heard a lot of talks about neurocorrelates of consciousness, which are super cool. But I want to bring in the body. I want to make a radical shift, and I hope you're going to follow me on that, yeah? And I want to say that the focus on the neural correlates comes from this lens that we have, tacit lens, which is adult-centric, neurocentric, and also, I would say, male embodiment-centric, and you're going to see why I'm saying this, yeah? And why is this important? Because if you want to understand the system, let's say you want to understand what is the fundamental structure of a certain system, and you take just the fully fledged like system as it develops, then you might be very tempted to just squeeze whatever properties you have like other system and just put it in a minimal thing and say that's what the thing is. But I don't think that's the case. And I'm going to move a bit to make you understand. So the properties that we have here are very different from the property that we have here as a system. Yeah. So this means that if you want to understand the system, it's not enough to look at squeeze things, you need to understand how this works like that. Yeah. And I want to go back to this example of the climbing mountain because it's an important point I want to make. So infants and babies have a way more developed olfactory system that we have. So they smell better than we do. Doesn't mean that we adults were less mature. No, doesn't mean, it means that at a certain stage of our development, we need certain things to be in place, and those are optimal for that stage. And this idea that we have somehow a continuum, we start very dumb and we end up very smart, I think that's naive. I think we really need to pay a close attention to every single step of our development if we want to understand how the system develops. Yeah. So as I said, I'm still obsessed with subjectivity of our experiences, but now I'm more obsessed with not what consciousness is and what self-consciousness is, but how we become self-aware and how we become self-conscious. And actually, I want to say something like provocative. I want to say that there is no such a thing as consciousness. And people say, what do you mean? Well, I want to say that why consciousness is not a thing. It's not a thing, it's not a noun. It's just like consciousness that you can, pinpoint, measure, and download from one head to another. I think it's more related, it's more like a verb, something we do. But I'm not going to develop this in this talk because that would be too much. I only have 20 minutes. So I very much interested, as I said, how we become self-aware and how we develop our self-awareness through our bodily experiences. Why? Because, as I said, I'm very interested in humble origins of whatever experiences we have. Yeah, and I want to start with something like, kind of like obvious. So going back to the picture of like the event. So again, this idea of adult-centric, and we talk about conscious experiences as somehow as related to the head and to the brain and to the neurons, and then consciousness, then we squeeze because we think that consciousness is related to the adult brain, then in order to understand how consciousness develops, we need to just like squeeze and look at what's happening in the infant brain. And I think that's not a good strategy. I'm going to try to convince you in my reminder of my talk why this is not a good strategy. So the key idea is that, well, minds and brains don't, first of all, again, I'm not going to talk about this in length, but I do have a principal objection about the very distinction between brain and body. I think it's kind of like a side effect of the tacit dualism that we inherited between mind and body. There is no principal reason why the brain shouldn't be part of the body. There is no ontological different system called the brain, which is different from the body. I don't say that the brain is part of the body and we have one single system, which is the body system. Yeah. So, so that's a side thing. But let's suppose that we kind of like take this view and say, well, you have this beautiful things called brains, but they don't emerge in a vacuum. They developed and have evolved a system dedicated to control and subserving the survival and reproduction of the organism. Yeah. So it's not as if the body is some sort of like, vehicle, like a car, which is supposed to fuel and transport the mind. It's that way around. Actually, the mind has evolved to make sure that this animal, this body, stays alive and survive as long as possible. Yeah, and this is something we share happily and proudly with other living species like animals. Yeah, but in mammals, our body do not emerge in vacuum either. They emerge in a different body, in another body. Yeah, and I want to stress this point because I think it's super important. So when we talk about pregnancy, typically people associate the state of pregnancy with a certain category of individuals that have the ability to carry babies in their bodies. But if you look at the state of pregnancy through the perspective of developing organism, all of you here, you shared your body with the body of another person. And I want to say that the pregnant state is a universal state. So it's not considered just some people. It basically concerns all of us. This is how we kick off our life journey inside another person's body in humans. Yeah. So we need to start not with the individual. We need not to start with the brain, but we need to start with the body, and not just with the body, but with body within another body case. Yeah. So it's a bit more complicated, the picture. Yeah. So I wrote about this idea that, well, if you want to understand the self, it's not enough to look at the self in relation to whatever the environment, because the mother's body is not an object where you like a basket when you drop an egg and there's like things happen. It's an active, it's a biological living system that, there is a negotiation there. Yeah. So, and there is a lot of evidence, that we already saw by now that the common view that the fetus is being passively contained and solipsistically trapped in the solitude and the silence of the womb is inaccurate. There is active bidirectional co-regulation between the two organisms from the very beginning. So I want to say radically that our life journey basically massively depends on the other. The second person comes first, right? It's a constant negotiation between the two organisms at a very low level. Before we have neurons, we have cells, developing cells. And I think the really interesting question is like how you get from one cell to a self, And in order to understand that, going back to the, the plant image that I show you, it's not enough to focus just on the adult plant, because that's going to tell you much about, the developing organism. We need to go back really at the humble cellular roots of our living system, yeah? And as I said, in humans, that is necessarily in connection with another living system. So there is a negotiation going there. Sometimes, I mean, all of us here, we're the product of a successful negotiation, because sometimes that doesn't happen, and there is other miscarriage or worse. So living systems are open system and vulnerable, and this idea that like self-preservation mechanism, and they are typically composed of cells which need to maintain the centennial stable state by converting food into usable energy. Again, keep an eye on the ball. Where is the food? Yeah, and grow and reproduce. So what I want to say here is just like I invite you to step back a bit from this like neuro perspective and just like really take a developmental roots from really beginning, because after all, neurons are one type of cells. It's just like cells are more fundamental than neurons, yeah. And I want to say something even more radical, and something I developed with some colleagues here in Boston. This idea that actually, again, the distinction between brain and body is something that we inherited from the Cartesian dualist tacitly, and somehow the mental are necessarily related to the brain. But I want to dispute that. We want to dispute that. We want to, if you go back, if we get a bit about the neurons, I go back to the cells, because you cannot really have neurons without having cells before. So that's the idea, yeah. And then at the level of cellular processing, what is the system that tells the organism which one is the self, which was not the self? So the immune system is very important for that, because if you don't have that in place, you don't develop later on, yeah. So, and interestingly enough, because I work on the field of embodied cognition, Francesco Varela, who is like the pioneer in this field, he was a biologist by training, and he was like obsessed with the immune system. He wrote a lot on the immune system with Maturana. Okay, so here is the point I want to make. I want to raise a flag, so to speak, like we need to be careful. First of all, not to focus on what is happening, zooming in just in the fetal brain or the infant brain, independent from the body, and more importantly, not to erase and forget about the body, the other body, because as I said, the pregnant state is universal state. All of us here shared our body with the body of another person. So this means that the fundamental steps in life are necessarily co-embodied from the very beginning, yeah? And we depend, I think I really like the touch talk this morning from, I'm sorry, I'm really bad with name, but he was based in Cambridge. This idea of like the tactile experiences are being so important, the affectivity from the very beginning. And as I said, this is something like, I think this is like the new way forward. As I said, it's like just forget about just focus on the brain, but also the brain in relation to other systems in the body. One very obvious is the cardiac system because of the rhythms, yeah, but not just one. And there is already a beautiful work, and I hope it's going to be more and more in the relationship between the two systems, yeah. This is something I also wrote with Adam. I think he was there somewhere. Hey. But I think we can gain a lot understanding about ourselves by looking at the humble roots of our bodily experiences and just not focus on the special side of the brain. And I'm going to end with a bit of self-promotion. So I'm writing a book. So here's the thing. So here's the pitch. You know, in French, if you add a "ni" to René, it becomes a female first name, like René, the Bridget Jones here. Yeah. So I'm a female philosopher. I'm lucky to live now, but if I had lived like 100 or 200 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to give this talk in front of you. Yeah. So females were allowed to go to university very recently in our societies. What does it mean? It means the entire concept of toolbox that we are operating with has been developed just by one side of humanity. And I think we are missing out things by just like not bringing in insights from, well, actually had half of the humanity. So in my book, I imagined this parallel world in which also women were allowed to do philosophy. And there is this like French philosopher called René Descartes with an E. And she's puzzled like her, you know, our counterpart about the mind-body problem, except that she's pregnant. Yeah. So how that the mind-body problem would look like for a pregnant female René Descartes. Yeah. So that's going to be my book about this, like how you change the fundamental puzzles in philosophy through the perspective of a different type of embodiment, which is also part of our humanity. And that's me, of course. Yeah. Yeah. And with that, I would like to thank my funders for giving me the means to make my idea happen, to my lab, who's doing all the beautiful work, and the organizer for inviting me here, and of course you for your attention. Thank you.
What do you think of the microbiome? Another body within a body.
Oh yeah, well, I actually like this idea of like open system and porous system. I find it reassuring. So I know that we are focusing a lot on vision when we talk about conscious experiences, but actually I can survive without seeing. I cannot survive without breathing. So this means I need, and without eating. So this, going back to my tomato, right? It's like, that was like, I think, oh, I had my hit me. I said, well, I think it's my grandmother from Burgundy. It's like always, I just say, food is so important. It's all about food. And this is why I was so happy this morning when Lorena presented the findings about hand movements. Well, yeah, it's like, I need to keep track where, you know, her stiff. Like, who cares about seeing the tomato? Yeah. So that's for us adults, we are puzzle obsessed about, but you know, you can't really get there if you don't have the food before. So, and so this means that if you forget a bit about vision and we look at different senses that you can relate with the world, engage with the world, like breathing, for instance, yeah, or eating, then we are constantly exchanging sensory information. We are composed by foreign, you know, because when you breathe oxygen because you need oxygen to survive, but you can also breathe a virus and then you're dead. So we are open system, as I said, vulnerable for better and for worse. We can, because we kind of like depend on others with these exchanges. And some people find this like, you know, terrifying. But I find it, on the contrary, I find it reassuring. I found like that there is like, you know, there is a bridge there, and there is a connectedness, and well, sometimes you have friends coming over, sometimes you have enemies, but somebody's coming over, you know, you're not alone. And I find that really reassuring.
Here. I want to come back to your image of the bean with the plant, because I wonder whether it's a correct image of what we are doing, in the sense that babies or fetuses have already a body like we have. They have already, and we saw this morning, and that they have the same brain network and so on and so on. So I think that we are more in the situation of the top, that the bean with the plant, but the big plant against the small plant, because otherwise I do not know how you want to ask questions of how to understand the early age if you do not, at least as a first step, say, okay, there is something described in adults, I test it in babies until I am on the wall and I cannot progress. I do not see how you want to to launch consciousness research in fetuses if you do not assume, or maybe I misunderstood, that there is some analogy or some same stuff in adults? And
yeah, so actually I want to bite a bullet on that. And I want to say that my cat and fetuses are probably way more conscious than we are. And I want to say by conscious in terms of like, if, depends on it, where to define consciousness here. So if thinking stands in the way, so basically overthinking, I actually have a paper called I Overthink, Therefore I'm Not, because I also work on people that are detached from themselves and too much in the head. So if you are overthinking, basically you're disconnecting from the body and then you feel unreal, but that's a different thing. And I didn't talk about this today, but I want to say that if the basis is really important, like the sensory experience, then maybe my cat and the fetuses and infants are in some sort of like blissful existence of like presence of, you know, presence, literally like being, which we lost just because we kind of like, you know, try to cognitively use a lens to understand it. And actually, this is just speculation on my behalf, but I think this is what people going on the mountains, they want to retrieve, right? Like in this meditation things, they want to just like, you know, just be without thinking, yeah. And then they retrieve this state of like pure awareness, pure being.
How do you know if it's like that or not like that? Because they did not answer. So what is your way to ask a question, to resolve the question? Because I can say, just, okay, you said that, I said something.
Yeah, so no, you're right. So I have two papers on theory work that I want to do on this, and then I want to test this like with, you know, pregnant persons. Is I have a paper called Two Notions of Experience, because I think there is experience is one of those words that everybody uses and has many, many different meanings. And I want to be clear what exactly we mean by experience. So philosophers are obsessed with the phenomenal what it is likeness of experience, which is the experiential side of it. But then there is a way where my grandmother would say, well, I have experience in opening the wine bottle because I opened the wine bottle before, right? So that's also a term of experience. The problem is they can't have the first one without the second. So it's just like we engage in the world through the experience in my grandmother's sense. Before we kind of like have this like sophisticated experience, I think that we as adults consider that to be the pinnacle. But I don't think, I mean, it's just a speculation of mine, but I think if we go back to redefine experience in such a way that actually we allow this exploratory thing of the environment through the senses to be a way of engaging with awarenessly, not being aware of, it's like not the content of it, yeah, like in the thinking part. But yeah, like the phenomenologist would say, it's just like a state of being, yeah, through the subjectivity. Then I think we have a different conceptual toolbox to look at that. And then you can use that to measure like the connectedness with the pregnant person, yeah. Longitudinally, for instance, like through the movement, through the way the people eat or smell or move in the flat, whatever. So you can track that at the sensory level. Yeah. So that would be my first hunch. But oh, I forgot to put the slide. But and I said to a couple of people here. So I'm going to organize a workshop. Claudia knows about it called the Nascent Self in Lisbon, in Sintra next year. And we're going to talk exactly about this, how we can contrast different type of understanding of experiences and how we can actually come up with clever paradigm to measure them, which are not necessarily through vision or language.
Is consciousness a prior or is an emergence when you consider sensory motor development in the natal and after the kids are born?
Yeah, so I want, as I said, it's like I want to stop talking about consciousness. No, I mean, we shouldn't talk about consciousness per se. We need to talk about conscious something, experiencing, processing, information, whatever. But it's like, it's not a thing. So it's not a thing that like a light bulb that appears when you have the required number of neurons to connect. Yeah, and then we have, before that it was complete darkness, and then bam, and there is consciousness. No, because it's not a thing, it's not an object that you can download like the upload series, like you consciousness the self from one head to another in a different body, and then you live forever. I don't think this goes this way. Yeah. So there is, I would, as I said, it's like I'm happy to bite the bullet to say there is a way of experiencing, in the sense I said, it's like the exploration, yeah, that is in place early on and is fully functional, is super important. And it's like blissful state of like not knowing what's coming next. And that makes you very conscious in that sense. Yeah, very much present.
Hi. So with this co-embodied view, and your move to say, okay, let's stop talking about when consciousness arises, which I think is very interesting, and I'm like, I really like this. But is it fair to say then that if we're talking, you know, this conference is about infants, and it seems more like you're focusing on fetuses here with the co-embodied. So, I mean, like, would we say that the fetus and the mother both together, there is consciousness? Like, would you want to associate the fetus embodied in the mother as participating within the consciousness that the mother has, because the mother is conscious of the baby, making decisions based on that, and the baby is not like intentionally acting on it, but there's a duality there. So we could push consciousness or refer to it as occurring to both simultaneously.
Okay. Well, I want to refrain to say that they have consciousness like a thing, right? No, I don't want to say that, but I want to say that I mean, none of us here choose to be alive. You know, so literally, it's like a thing that we drive us like keep going, yeah, and that depends upon another, and actually even it depends upon another, even if in infants, because you don't have like close connectedness with the caregiver to give you food, you know, it's like you don't really survive. So the other is there and has to be there, you know, from the very beginning. But so I would say that it's precisely in the process of this negotiation that you understand what is the self and another. And if you close your eyes and try to make an effort of imagination, what it is you'll be like your first sensory experiences when you're, well, if you are inside another person's body, you have already a sensory rich presence, because the heart of the mother is beating all the time, even when you sleep. So you have a rhythmical life. That is like there from the very beginning, and also the movement. So there is, yeah, as I said, the second person comes first. So it's like, it's there. And then you have to negotiate. Yeah.
So I want to make an argument for consciousness as a noun, because if you think about the work that Lorena did with Adrian Owen, the ability to say that these group of unresponsive people are different in a morally important way than another group of unresponsive people, you know, the conscious versus the unconscious, that seems like a very practical and compelling reason to think that, yes, consciousness is a thing that is present or absent, and our ability to distinguish is important.
I understand, but I mean, morality is something like high level, you know, it's like you don't deny an infant consciousness just because he cannot be charged in a court. Yeah, it's like, you know, it's two different things.
Great.
Yeah,
Let's thank Dr. Ciaunica for an excellent talk. Thanks to you, ladies.
So thank you. Yeah, I'm a pediatric neurologist, developmental pediatrician, and I had training in embryology as well. I'm humbled to be here. I am an amateur philosopher. I'm interested in philosophy, but not trained in that. I think about the developing brain. I've looked at it from the very beginning for many years. I have more questions than answers here today. Thought about how do you talk about this topic in 15 or 20 minutes? I'm going to show you some fetal tissue, talk about synaptogenesis a little bit, but I thought maybe we should just frame this topic a little bit, and I just flipped together 10 axioms, and I'm going to define that. 3 conjectures talk a little bit about synaptogenesis, show you tissue, interject some ideas about definitions and beliefs. And then lastly, what does this have to do with fetal healthcare? I work in with a group of doctors that sees pregnant mothers, most of whom are halfway through pregnancy and having some problems with their fetus. So this is all coming together. This means something to many people. So axioms are self-explanatory. I think for the most part, these are truisms. This is what I mean by axiom here is that we have robust evidence and that this is readily acceptable. Conjectures are something that's getting close to that, but we can still debate it. I'm going to give you plenty of material today that will be something that we may not agree with. So axiom 1, neurodevelopment is continuous. And I think we can all agree with this. All of the different presentations today that are showing evidence about how things change over time would support this, whether it's behavior, synaptic plasticity, functional adaptation, imaging, all of these modes. These boundaries between areas in development are artificial. The example that I like the best is that even the words first trimester and second trimester and third trimester are artificial. That was invented by actually Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the decision in 1973 on Roe v. Wade. That was just invented, and he agreed that that was arbitrary. Axiom number 2. This slide's already been shown this morning. This is a very sophisticated audience. I don't have to repeat this. We know that most of neurodevelopmental events are sequential and very time specific. If you miss a stage, you can't go back and repeat that stage. We start with neurulation, proliferation, neuroblast, migration, neuronal differentiation. Synaptogenesis comes after that. Synaptic pruning comes after that, and myelination. And this goes on throughout, well, at least into adulthood. So axiom number 3, maturational processes are continuous. We start out with stem cells, they become progenitor cells, they become neuroblasts and glioblasts, they migrate, become mature neurons, specialize, and different brain regions at different rates. So this is axiom number 3, we can agree. Axiom number 4, and this was mentioned this morning already, not all neurotransmission is the same, it changes over time. And again, my favorite example is gamma-aminobutyric acid, which acts differently on neurons in early development as a stimulator of cell proliferation. And later on, it's of course the most common, the most robust inhibitory neurotransmitter in the adult brain. So axiom number 5, we can debate. Fetal brain volume, weight, mass, and neuron number do not fully explain function or consciousness. When we think about how small these embryos are, especially in the first 12 weeks, as you can see, fitting in the palm of your hand, we're seeing pregnant mothers who are getting an anatomic ultrasound between 18 and 20 weeks, and we're seeing anatomy and we're making judgments on those brains. I have to remind myself that's a brain that weighs between 40 and 50 grams. And then try to picture this, and I do this for parents as well. That's the size of a strawberry. So there's obviously rapid growth. We think of the full-term infant brain as about 300 grams, doubles in size in 5 months, triples in size in a year. So 900 grams by a year of age. The adult brain weighs about 1,300 grams. So you're about 2/3 of the way to the adult brain at a year of age. But when we're making decisions medically, we're talking about a strawberry-sized brain. And we can measure this with neuroimaging as well. You can see morphology, how the brain develops functionally. So there's something like 86 billion neurons in the human brain. 80% of them live in the cortex, in a part of the brain that doesn't seem to be responsible for consciousness. The cerebellum is a very important organ, but only about 16 billion of them live in the cerebral cortex. This is where we think consciousness lives. Human beings have the most cerebral cortical neurons. and other species. We can compare this to other species in terms of the numbers and then compare what they do. But brain size in and of itself isn't going to explain it. So axiom number 6, spinal and brainstem reflexes do not equal consciousness. This has been very confusing to a lot of people who are looking at 4D ultrasounds that show movement. And we know there are a number of spinal cord and brainstem reflexes that occur very early, and we can list them: startles at 9 and hiccups at 9 weeks of age, gestational age, periodic breathing 10 to 13, body thrust, non-nutritive sucking 13 weeks gestation, tongue protrusion 18 to 20 weeks. When we talk about early nutritive sucking, that's the time when babies can survive. That's a survival mechanism. Midline hand touching, 23 weeks, facial expressions, 25. We see olfactory reflexes at about 30 weeks gestation, pupil constriction 31, and then coordinated sucking around the time of where babies are destined to survive. So we can take each one of these reflexes and actually neuroanatomically explain it. This is a yawning center in the reticular activating system. This can be explained. There's a loop. There's a neuroscience behind this. But as mothers may look at prenatal ultrasounds, they may confuse this, say, that this brainstem reflex is actually something more meaningful. Axiom number 7. Thalamocortical synaptogenesis begins after fetal viability. This is the final phase of axonal pathfinding. This is the data that I'm going to show you now. And this statement about looking at synapses at 22 weeks gestation. And this is done best from the neuropathology point of view, through immunocytochemistry, which is actually using antibodies, looking for immunoreactivity with markers that justify looking at synapses. So the tissues that I'm going to show you are from normal fetal brains collected over 20 years by my colleague and friend Harvey B. Sarnat, who I've been working with for the last 30 years. These are 80 brains ranging from 6 to 41 weeks. These were spontaneous stillbirths or pregnancies that were terminated for non-neurological issues. And all of the bleeding brains and chromosomopathies and all of the malformations of the brain syndromes were eliminated. So this is our best effort to try to look at tissue from what we think is normal fetal tissue. This is a comment where definitions are very important. We tend to want to use the term gestational age. If you use the term conceptional age, and you'll see that in the literature, you're going to be about 14 to 17 days off. One of the problems with both of these terms is that according to studies, 50% of women can't really remember when they're the first day of their last menstrual period. So straight away, we're making an estimate half the time. So whether you use one term or not, or the other, you have to know which one you're using in order to gauge age. So this is a 21-week fetus on the left by imaging coming from the publicly available atlases by US. But just looking at imaging tissue at a far level, you can see the subventricular zone, the intermediate zone, cortical plate blown up. You can see that, but looking at actual neurons under the microscope gives you so much more detail, and we just don't have access to this most of the time, but we can learn from it. So at this age, these are Cajal vitreous neurons up here, 3 of them in the molecular layer. This is the cortical plate, which is the future cerebral cortex. Looking at fiber-oriented distribution and just T2 weighted images of a 26-week-old, we can now see that in the molecular layer, there's strong synaptophysin reactivity in the molecular zone. And this extends into layer 2 of the cortex. And there's robust immunoreactivity of the thalamocortical neurons, even at 26 weeks, but very little at the outer levels, level 5 and level 6. The 33-week fetus By this point, we can see strong synaptophysin reactivity demonstrated in the molecular zone, as well as the deeper cortical layers with still less intense reactivity in layer 2. And then by the time you're at term, there's very robust immunocytochemistry, immunoreactivity at all layers by the time an infant is born at 40 weeks. So axiom number 8, not all neurons are created equal. This is demonstrated by Santiago Ramon y Cajal in 1896 or something with the beginning of microscopy. We've known this, these are his drawings from 1905, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1906, describing that basically all neurons are not the same. Not all synapses are created equal. Again, this has been a topic of discussion for 2,500 years. Aristotle talked about vital pneumo. Descartes described mechanical corpuscles. Galvini described an electrical phenomena. Cajal, who did the drawings, knew that there was something that these neurons didn't quite link so well. But it wasn't until Sherrington, at the end of the 19th century, who actually described the word synapse. And if you haven't had a chance to look at this book, which is available online, this has been compared to Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. This is the most incredible book written. Just the fact that it was written 125 years ago is just so incredible. He won the Nobel Prize for this in 1932. This is a snippet from that book. In view, therefore, of the probable importance of physiologically of this mode of nexus between neuron and neuron, it is convenient to have a term for it. The term introduced has been called synapse. And again, there was a time when we didn't have a word. So not all synapses are created equal. Some synapses we know are permanent. Spinal cord, cranial nerve, cerebellum, corda striatum. Other synapses continue to evolve throughout life. So they delete and form again, especially in the hippocampus, cerebral cortex, olfactory bulb, and thalamus. Because of time, I will skip over a lot of this. This article came out earlier this month. It's an incredible study. Bottom line, all synapses are not the same. There's a lot of different types of synapses, neurotransmitter effects, receptors, brain regions, plasticity, different types of neurons, synapses. And these authors break it down to all the things that can go awry at the RNA level and the transcriptome, proteome. And they talk about this concept, not of the connectome, but of the interactome, which is again, at the molecular level. So digging way down, the complete set of molecular interactions in a cell or organism or between proteins. So it's as complicated as you want to make it. And that leads to axiom number 10. Neurovariation or neurodiversity, not neurodivergence, is infinite. Why is that? Well, we have 20,000, 22,000 protein coding genes of perhaps 140,000 if you look at introns that are not protein coding. Something like 5 out of 6 of every neuron is expressed in the brain. At least we think half of the neurons are only expressed, the genes are only expressed in the brain, third to a half. 10% of the genome has copy number variants on the chromosome. And we know of over 10 million benign variants, SNPs previously called polymorphisms. And then we have environmental factors that can cause mutability, ranging from teratogens, timing of teratogens, which teratogen, maternal tradition. And this overlaps with Anna's talk from last hour. Okay, I agree. A field in and of itself. So again, neurovariation, infinite, 16 billion cortical neurons. The average neuron has 10,000 synapses depending on where it is. So then you can get your calculators out and try to do the math here. I don't know what the exact number is, 1.6 times 10 to the 13th, which is, I guess, is 100 trillion neurons, beyond anyone's imagination in terms of complexity, and this is just the cerebral cortex. And the word complexity in its definition means that it's adaptable. That is what complexity means. Biological systems are adaptable. So the philosophical area, which I know very little about, but I've read about a little bit, is mereology, which is this part to whole relationships. It's a field of philosophy in and of itself, studying brain as a whole. We've done this with our brain death literature when we're looking at loss of consciousness at the end of life in terms of what functions are lost, and it is the whole brain lost at the end of life, but it could be applied as well to the emergence of fetal consciousness. So, okay, so what is it? Axioms 1 through 7 talk about ontogenic consistency, and axioms 8 through 10 talk about developmental diversity. So what is it for a minute? So we know that trajectories are reproducible. They have a certain sequence. They're precisely timed. All these fetuses are doing it the same way unless they have some type of genetic disorder. And on the developmental diversity, all of these other axioms say, wait a minute, we're all different, all of us. And especially in this era of DEI and everybody, criticizing that, it should be the next frontier of humanity, I think, that we talk about how all human beings, all Homo sapiens are universally diverse, of course. So that leads me to my first conjecture. Not all consciousness is created equal. Now we haven't been talking about this too much, but we have the potential that when we talk about these fetuses, they're not all going to have emergence of consciousness at the same. There's going to be variability here. 67% of the population has an IQ between 85 and 115, if we look at that type of thing. Most infants walk at around a year of age, but some walk at 9 months of age, some walk at 14 months of age, and they're all normal. There's this range. So why wouldn't consciousness also have a distribution? Conjecture number 2, and I think this is very important for this conference, a required minimum threshold, and others have written about this, of functional connectivity as a requisite for consciousness. In other words, below some level, whether you're talking about the strawberry size 50-gram 20-week brain, or you're talking about some further level in the 20 gestational weeks or 30s, based on number of neurons, thalamocortical connections, number of synapses, regional networks, but below some level, you have unconsciousness. And conjecture number 3, so this would be something that we can discuss at length. I think this is still a conjecture, but that sensory perception comes first, self-awareness comes afterwards, cognition later, and then whatever words you want to use, interoception before exteroception. And if you want to use the 17th century literature or terminology, sapience and sentience, which I haven't heard yet today, but I guess it's outdated. But one probably comes before the other, and that would be, so my conclusion. So recent medical research and analysis, especially since 2007, provides strong evidence that for the conclusion that a functioning cortex is not necessary to experience pain. Well, that's not my definition. That's what it says in a bill in front of Congress called the Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. And that's what it says, which implies that fetuses are feeling pain before the level of the strawberry-sized brain, and they're feeling it more intense. And as a matter of fact, you can get opinions of people that will say things like this: it is my opinion that the human fetus possesses the ability to experience pain from 20 weeks of gestation, if not earlier, and the pain perceived by a fetus is possibly more intense than perceived by term newborns or older infants. So this is an opinion coming from a report commissioned by the United States Justice, used in that bill, which has passed the United States House of Representatives 3 times with a majority vote, and the United States Senate with a majority vote twice, and it's still up. But there are ramifications of what all of this means, which I can get into. So we look at babies and what they can do, and there's a variation. This is a 10-month-old, happens to be my granddaughter, but she's not really reading the New York Times. It's a cute picture, but we also see this variability. I want to get back to that because we've seen infants. I have seen infants that can talk at 8 months of age and can read around 8 or 9 months, been described. And we have this hyperlexia phenomenon, which we see in babies. And then if you come to my clinic, you'll see lots of kids who can't do any of that. That's what we see in child neurology. But there's this huge variation. And I think of all the things I've said here today, I'd like to open up this concept that the emergence of human consciousness also has a range, a spectrum. And lastly, if there is time to discuss it, I'll talk to you about what this means for fetal healthcare. I can comment on that in just a second if needed, but I'll end there. Thank you. Right. Questions?
Thank you very much. And this is very interesting. However, a question about the link between the range view and the minimal threshold view. So is your view that the minimum threshold is required because of some emergent properties that emerge at some point? But do you have some particular evidence, or do you have a strong sort of a causal mechanism that you posit there?
Okay, so the bill in front of Congress, and I'm not going to be political here at all. It's not my intent. Is to change the criminal code of the United States to criminalize physicians for mentioning the word abortion after 20 weeks because of pain, because of the fetus's ability to perceive pain. So if you watched the NewsHour last night, there was a report on the rising rates of maternal sepsis, of women not getting care because physicians aren't allowed to care for them when a woman is hemorrhaging or a woman is miscarrying. And this is leading to an inaction. This has nothing to do with fetal pain, but it overlaps because this Texas law happened a year before Dobbs. So we already have data for those of us who do fetal medicine. About half of the country now cannot discuss the option of a termination of pregnancy in a mother who's carrying a fetus with a severe malformation. Those mothers in Texas would have to go to term and carry that. And what we've seen now documented, this paper came out a year ago, last May, that it results in a rising rate of infant mortality. So this all gets back to the pain-capable unborn child act phenomena. And this is where the things we're discussing today actually have real-life consequences from my perspective. Of course, we believe in fetal medicine that women need to make the decisions. We only inform women about the health of their fetus. We are not pro-abortion, that has nothing to do with it. We're talking about fetal healthcare. And if there is a belief that fetuses below 50 grams, 18 weeks gestation have intense pain responses, which I think there's very limited evidence to support that, then we get into this area between knowledge and belief. And in an era where there's lots of misinformation, we have to think about how we define these things.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Just a quick comment on what I just said. I think we should focus on the diet between. I mean, because well, a pain from an unhealthy mother will be felt by fetuses as well. So we need to make sure that the co-embodied system is happy, not just one. But as was just a comment. I want to go back to the distinction that you said that actually the first trimester, the second, the third, they kind of like random invented, distinctions. But I read that actually those distinctions were made in relation to the reactions of the immune system and the placenta. Yeah. So here is another thing that is kind of like left aside in this discussion, which is the placenta, which is like the relational organ par excellence between the two systems. And the reason why there are 3 trimesters is because in the first 3 months, there is an inflammatory response to the new thing. This is why most of the pregnant person know that the first 3 months you're just like unwell, you're not happy. And then you have the next 3 months where there is like negotiation is successful, so the immune system are working in tandem for developing of the baby. And then you have the third part where you need to, well, get the baby out. So then you have like the explosion. So do you think that if we look at the relationship between the immune responses between the 2 systems, that makes actually that distinction makes sense, it's not just random?
I always think of the most complicated organ system in the human body as the brain, and the second most complicated organ system in the human body is the immune system. And that too is an evolution, and actually very dysfunctional, which is why babies are so susceptible to infection. I think some of the points that need to be made in terms of lumping into first, second, third trimester or cutoff, I actually was very happy with the concept of row that we talked about, viability. I don't think anybody really had a problem with that. Right now, viability has come down to about 22 weeks, about a 50% mortality rate, and a lot of disability, both for 22 and 23 weekers. And then the further you get into pregnancy, the higher the survivability is, as we've discussed already today. I guess my only point with this arbitrary cutoffs in terms of the timing is there's a big difference between a 27-weeker and a 30-weeker. On EEG in the ICU, 27-week babies do not have enough cortical activity to create a seizure, for example, even if they're bleeding and they have a sick brain. Their EEGs aren't, we cannot diagnose seizures at that level. There's not enough neuron activity to produce a seizure, whereas that could definitely happen in the 30s. It gets very interesting in the 30s, week by week, as we've heard about already this morning. But all of these factors, that's why I think axiom number 10, which is that this is infinitively complex and beyond, and will remain beyond anyone's complete understanding. Because if you get down to the molecular level, and you're talking about individual transmitters and neurotransmitters and proteins, it's just as complicated as anyone wants to have it, which makes it so humble.
Hi. Yeah, great. Thanks. That was a really great talk. So thanks for that. I just wanted to go back for a second to the kind of practical societal impact of this like pain ability of the fetus. And I have a very naive kind of point to make about this. I feel like the consequence might be perhaps to bring in some pain management to these situations. And I wonder what you think about that and whether that could kind of help the whole debate and bring it onto another level.
So repeat this, you're talking about pain at that level, or what, pain perception?
Yes, so I feel like perhaps the fact that these fetuses are able to feel pain is actually a very important point to make, but might have the consequence of the physicians using pain management in abortion or the care situation so that they don't get pain, because not caring for their cattle, which then has consequences both on the potential pain of the mother.
So for me, this is the crux of the whole discussion. At what point, I actually agree with Antonio and Hannah Damasio in their multiple papers where they use different terms, but talk about homeostatic feelings and the emergence of consciousness. Pain perception requires consciousness. So at what point, and then you have all of these fetal reflexes, which are stimulus induced. Most of them are spinal cord and brainstem reflexes. And yet this is a process of continuous development. And it's basically our understanding that this cannot happen until after fetal viability, probably after 26 weeks, just emerging. That's what our synaptogenesis studies that would be our bias. And other people can debate this. But women aren't getting abortions at 26 weeks. Nobody has a problem. Let me make this very, very clear. Abortion is controversial, but 90% of abortions happen before 8 weeks. The American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology, ACOG, recommends that women get an anatomic screen between 18 and 20 weeks, and 3% have an anomaly. And these are women who want to be pregnant and want to have a healthy baby and are getting health care. And we're having laws now that would prohibit a discussion between a physician and a mother about what to do, decisions to be made, and in part based on an assertion that fetuses at that age feel pain. So I actually don't believe that personally. So I don't think that that's true, but there's room to disagree.
Last question. So my question was really about the same issue, which is what evidence would be brought to bear on distinguishing between a reflex to withdraw potard and feeling pain? And I'm on your side on that. But that's really the topic of the.
I think this is why it's confusing. I mean, if you go on the internet and you look at these 4D ultrasounds and you see these babies sort of moving and grimacing, a lot of mothers emotionally will say this baby is feeling things, but actually neuroanatomically we don't have that evidence. Anyway, but it's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Dr. Graf.
All right, well, thank you all for coming to this fetal consciousness symposium. So I'm here to talk to you today about the temporal grain of fetal perception, assuming that maybe fetuses are conscious in the 3rd trimester, obviously an open question. And I'm going to be showing you some evidence to address this question coming from fetal magnetoencephalography, or MEG, okay? So just to give a little bit on my background, who am I? How did I get interested in this topic? So I'm Joel Frohlich. I'm a postdoc at the University of Tubingen in Germany at the Fetal MEG Center. So I work with a very niche application of MEG, which is fetal MEG. So many people have heard of adult MEG, fewer people have heard of fetal MEG, and I'm going to show a video to explain how the fetal application works on the next slide. So we'll just hold that till then. I have my PhD in neuroscience from UCLA in 2018. And in my dissertation lab, I was working on neurodevelopmental disorders. So I come from this developmental world, but then in my first postdoc, I was working on disorders of consciousness and sleep. And the nice thing is that in Tubingen, really these two worlds converge, of course, on my interest in the developmental origins of consciousness, okay? So I'm lucky enough to get to study 3rd trimester fetal brain activity using this rare and expensive tool we have in Tubingen under the supervision of Professor Hubert Preissl, who's in this photograph with me here, next to our fetal MEG device. Okay, so what is fetal MEG? So here's a video showing how this works. Probably you all know about adult MEG with the helmet that comes over the head. So this is a concave sensor array that complements the maternal abdomen. So you see here the pregnant woman kneels in front of the device. We can display visual stimuli for the fetus using red light, red LEDs that pass through tissue. And we can also have auditory stimuli with the sound balloon here, which is MEG compatible and plays auditory tones, okay? And so I'm going to be discussing some auditory stimulation data today. This was work that started before I came to Tubingen. So this work started with Dr. Julia Moser. So her work was mentioned briefly during Professor De Haen-Labentz's keynote this afternoon. So this was applying the local global auditory oddball paradigm to fetuses. Of course, this has also been applied in infants, but Julia Moser decided to apply this paradigm to fetuses. And I mean, it's already been discussed earlier today, so I think most of you are generally familiar with it. But this is a passive auditory task that at least has better than chance accuracy for detecting consciousness. The idea is that you play these auditory sequences. Okay, you can have auditory deviance both between and within sequences. But the idea is that, you know, to detect a deviant within a sequence is trivial. To detect a deviant between sequences, the bar is much higher for that. It requires a longer memory trace, dependent on working memory. And in turn, it's thought that working memory is dependent on consciousness. So there's some reason to believe that perhaps the global prediction error is linked to consciousness. So that's been investigated since Bekenstein et al. 2009 PNAS and anesthesia, and since then disorders of consciousness and so forth. So again, this paradigm has been discussed earlier today, for example, during the keynote, so I won't go into too much more detail, but if there are questions, feel free to ask later. So to cut to the chase with Julia Moser's work, she actually found that you do get this global prediction error 600 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. However, what's really strange here is that the local prediction errors are missing in fetuses, okay? And that's unusual because the bar for local prediction errors should be much lower than the bar for global prediction errors, okay? So what's going on here? Well, Professor De Haan-Lamberts during her keynote mentioned this explanation that was also in her review paper from last year in Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. So this is a pretty compelling hypothesis. I'll call it the diffuse stimulus hypothesis. In a nutshell, what this is saying is that maybe the temporal grain of fetal perception is low enough that these individual stimuli within a sequence are just sort of being smeared or fused together, okay? And if that's the case, then the fetus doesn't really stand a chance of showing a local prediction error because, well, from its point of view, the whole sequence was one stimulus to begin with, okay? So just to be clear, instead of 4 separate tones in a sequence, this would just be smudged together into one big stimulus. So before I continue, I think this is easier if I can actually play the stimuli for the audience. I have to switch off the mic, so I'll just explain first what each of these are. So first, you're going to hear what an example auditory sequence would sound like to you as an adult. And then I'll play a couple possible simulations of how the fetus might perceive the stimulus. So again, the first one you heard, boop, 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 boop. That's roughly what you would hear. And then we've sped it up to simulate how a fetus might hear it, assuming that the temporal resolution with which the fetus might hear the world is very low. For instance, you might expect a sequence to sound like 4 identical tones. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, say you just heard that 100 times over during the training phase of the experiment. And then during the test phase, you hear boop, 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 boop. Okay, so that would be both a local and a global deviant. Now, it could also be that during the training phase, you expect there to be a deviant at the end. It could be that you hear boop, 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 boop. Okay, so now you expect the last tone to be different. And then during the test phase, you hear boop, 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 4 identical tones. So obviously, there's no local deviant within that sequence, right? It's 4 identical tones, but it violates the template that you were trained on, so to speak. Okay. Okay. So going back to the fused stimulus hypothesis, I think this hypothesis has a lot of plausibility, especially based on what we already know about the temporal grain of infant perception. This has been talked about in other presentations today. We had 2 presentations about stimulus masking this morning, so I think you all know what I'm referring to. But for instance, the attentional blink is much longer, 6 times longer in infants than it is in adults. And also the multisensory integration window is longer in infants than it is in adults. So all of that suggests that very early in development, you just have a more coarse grain of temporal perception. All right. So if this hypothesis is true, then it should be that when you have this sequence of 4 tones, you just you don't get individual neural responses to each tone. You just would get one overall neural response to the sequence as a whole. And just the same way that, if you're watching a movie and say the monitor has a 60 hertz refresh rate, and we're recording EEG from your scalp, we're not going to get a 60 hertz train of neural responses in the EEG because the 60 hertz film is just being fused into one continuous stimulus, right? Now, on the other hand, if this hypothesis is false, then we might actually get individual neural responses for each stimulus in the sequence, okay? And moreover, because for the stimulus sequence, we have regular intervals, we should expect to get frequency tagging. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, specifically for these local global auditory data, the stimulus had a 600 millisecond interval from the onset of one stimulus to the next. So that corresponds to a frequency tag of 1.67 hertz, which we would see in the frequency transform of the signal. Okay, now there's a caveat here, which is that unfortunately, fetal MEG data are extremely noisy, as you can imagine. It's really hard to non-invasively record fetal brain signals, but we can get around that by just optimizing our signal-to-noise ratio, our SNR, by averaging across all of our recordings, okay? So that gives us a better SNR, and therefore we have a better chance of actually seeing this frequency tag, okay? So basically the way this would work is we average all of our recordings, we do a frequency transform, specifically the FFT or the fast Fourier transform with very high frequency resolution. And we would look at a frequency of interest, 1.67 hertz in this case. We would compare the SNR at that frequency to the flanking amplitudes on either side, okay? Now, of course, our experiment has 4 conditions, 2 local, 2 global. We just concatenate those conditions horizontally, okay? That gives us one long signal. And like I say, we stack an average and then we do the FFT. So you might say, wait, well, we've averaged across all of our recordings. Don't we lose all the between subjects variance? So like, how do we do inferential statistics? Okay, so there's 2 approaches to this. One is a parametric approach. And in this approach, we look at the SNR in our frequency neighborhood of interest. And using the mean standard deviation across different frequency bins, we assign a z-score to the SNR at our peak frequency. And then we convert that z-score to a one-tailed p-value. So in other words, that's like asking, how does the amplitude at 1.67 hertz compare to that of other frequencies? Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. If you have a frequency amplitude spectrum, you can also get an SNR spectrum and then just do the z-score and your neighborhood of interest. The other approach is a non-parametric approach. So this relies on something called surrogate data. So before we do the stack and average, we can actually manipulate all of our recordings to destroy the temporal alignment between them so that when we actually stack them, we don't expect there to be a time-locked signal that gets preserved in the averaging. So that's done by basically scrambling the Fourier phases of the signal, but preserving the Fourier amplitudes. So again, that's called surrogate data. We can just do that 1,000 times, build a null distribution, and then compute an empirical p-value. I know that's a little bit technical, but the bottom line here is that with the non-parametric approach, we're asking, how does the 1.67 hertz amplitude compare with the surrogate data? Okay, so these surrogate signals, they'll have the same amplitude spectrum, but different Fourier phases. So stack those together many times and build your null distribution. Okay, so with that, let's just dive into the results. So on the left, you have the time domain grand averaged signal from the fetal data. All right, so this is 80-something recordings from 40-something fetuses, meaning that some pregnant women return to the lab multiple times, so some longitudinal data. The vertical dashed lines are the stimuli onsets. So a good thing is we don't see any time-locked artifacts. That's really good, of course. And then on the right, you have the power spectrum the way you might typically compute it, for instance, using Morley wavelets. But for the frequency tagging, we don't actually want to do this spectral smoothing or tapering. Those of you who are into signal processing know what I'm talking about. It's rare that you just take the raw FFT, but in this case, we have a very frequency specific effect that we want to look for. And what's been done, for instance, in frequency tagging EEG studies in infants is you just look at the raw FFT and then you look for the peak in that amplitude spectrum. So indeed, we have the peak at our frequency of interest. And this is statistically significant according to both the parametric and the non-parametric approach, which is great. So then newborns return to the lab in a few cases, 20 specifically. We have one recording from each newborn. We can actually record with the same device. You just put the infant in a cradle, head first toward the sensor array, lie the infant's head on the sensor array, and then you put this infant-friendly headphone on to play the stimuli. Okay, so in this case, again, on the left, you have the time domain, grand average signal. On the right, you have the power spectrum. And now I show you the FFT amplitude spectrum. We have a clear peak at our frequency of interest. It's significant according to the parametric approach, not significant according to the non-parametric. That might be because we only had 20 recordings. Remember in the previous case, we had over 80, so our SNR is just lower. But at any rate, a little bit unclear. Nonetheless, our main hypothesis here was about the fetuses. Now, next, of course, we want to ask if this can be replicated in other data. And fortunately, we have a really good data set for testing generalizability. This is a statistical learning data set where 32 fetuses with usable data were exposed to this random stream of 3 random auditory tones per second. So obviously, that should give us a 3 Hertz frequency tag. So again, I'll just play an example of what this sounds like if we switch off the mic. Okay, so yeah, that's the stimuli that we exposed the fetuses to. Originally, there were 2 experimental conditions, but they're not really relevant to the hypotheses we're testing here. So again, we can horizontally concatenate data across conditions, and just like last time, we stack an average. So again, the left is the time domain grand average signal. The right is the wavelet power spectrum. And then we have the FFT amplitude spectrum. And again, this is statistically significant according to both approaches, like what we saw in the first experiment, which is really great. So just briefly, I wanted to talk about how this relates to some previous work. There's another fetal MEG site at the University of Arkansas Medical Center here in the US. They did a similar experiment a few years ago. They didn't actually look at trains of discrete stimuli, but rather this amplitude modulation of a 500 Hertz carrier wave. Actually, I'll also play this stimulus. Okay, so you could hear that kind of had a ringing sound to it, but it's not actually separate stimuli. So indeed, they found that there's this 27 Hertz auditory steady state response, but it doesn't actually demonstrate that the fetal brain responds to individual stimuli. And then similarly, about 10 years ago at Tubingen, there was a study looking at numerosity detection in fetuses. Do they respond differently to sequences of 4 versus 2 tones? The bottom line is that they do, but that could still be consistent with the fused stimulus hypothesis because at least the analysis that was run didn't look at individual responses. And so you could say, okay, they're distinguishing a longer sequence versus a shorter sequence. Okay, so I think that the data I've showed you today are actually the first direct test of this fused stimulus hypothesis. It's a big technical achievement for fetal MEG. It opens up the door to new ways to analyze the data. But most importantly for you all, it shows some evidence, perhaps, that the temporal grain of fetal perception is finer than we may have thought. And it's also very important context for understanding this paper by Moser et al. From 2021. Again, this is the work that showed global prediction errors, but not local prediction errors in fetuses. Important limitation to note, this still could be consistent with the fused stimulus hypothesis. It could be that in higher order association cortices, maybe the stimuli are still being fused there. Most likely the signals we recorded are in primary sensory cortices, although fetal MEG, it's impossible to do source localization. And of course, the fetal head is oriented differently in every recording. So it certainly doesn't falsify the fused stimulus hypothesis, but it seems like a challenge to the hypothesis at least. Okay, so I just want to thank my collaborators, Dr. Katrin Sippel, University of Tubingen, who did the pre-processing algorithms for the data. It's very difficult work to clean these fetal signals. Again, Dr. Julia Moser, who started this work in fetuses, Professor Tim Bain, who's here with us, with whom I've had many discussions about infant consciousness, and we've written several review papers together on the topic, and then Professor Hubert Preissel, who's the director of the Fetal MEG Center and supervised this work. really quick, shameless plug. I have a Substack newsletter. If you want to hear my opinions on fetal consciousness, in particular, this post, which I think is really relevant to the previous talk, on why it's very difficult to communicate this work to the public, because they hear the word fetus and they often think of early term fetuses, second trimester fetuses, and they treat this neurobiologically as the same thing. Okay, so there's kind of this public ignorance of the fact that fetuses are really different at different developmental stages. And I think it might even be appropriate for us to start using different terms or different words for fetuses in the second trimester versus the third trimester. All right, so thanks so much for your attention, and I will take questions now.
That's very nice. But you just say that I was saying it's fused. It was just trying to explain why you do not have XXXY response. So, and you did not answer why they are not able to discriminate when you have a local change, which is the main problem of the, and I was trying to find an explanation that they may be fusion. So sure. I am totally convinced, but what you show, it's not fusion, at least at the low level. But how do you explain that they are not able to discriminate XXX boop when we know that they are able to do it in many other experiments?
Good question. So there's a lot of different ways to analyze that data set. Again, I wasn't actually at Tubingen when that work was done. What I recall is that they compared the third tone in the stimulus to the fourth tone in the stimulus. You could also compare the fourth tone between sequences. We've thought about other ways to do this. I've actually played around with it a bit. I think there might be something there in the data, but I don't want to say until we've really gotten a chance to thoroughly analyze it. I think what's actually going to happen is we're going to use a much larger data set that only has the first order auditory oddball paradigm. So like the classic paradigm, not the local global. So we have a very large data set with that experimental paradigm. And then we could really do a thorough test with a really good sample size of whether we get the local deviance.
You have previous paper to trace that already data to show that this could
Yeah.
as many on the paradigm before.
Right.
So
we have a lot of data, yeah. And I think, you know, it was a
just a lack of power, and that in fact you have local and global, so from 35, and about nothing before, because in this paper, in Julie professor paper,
they have no effect at all from 20 whatever to 35.
Right.
And after that 35, I was surprised by the fact that you do not have the local effect, which I can understand, maybe a lack of power, some of whatever. But what do you say now about the earlier? Do you think you have effect or not at all?
Wait, so I think there's two different questions, right? So first we're asking.
Okay. So for some reason, which can happen in babies' data and fetal data, you do not see the statistical effect of local deviant, but you should have it, given that they are able to follow, and that in previous papers that your group publish, you find a mismatch response when you have a oddball. So, okay, I admit that everything is okay from 35, but to come back to our question here, I was wondering whether you have looked also, and especially with your new frequency tagging analysis, about the earlier age, so between 28 and 35, and do you confirm that there is no effect, or is it still a question?
Okay, so to break this down, you're just asking, have I broken down the frequency tagging effect by age?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so good. I kind of have a supplementary slide that addresses this. It's a little bit tricky because of course we do the stack and average across recordings. So to actually do any kind of correlation with a developmental variable, we have to do this bootstrapped resampling. So in other words, you have to resample a subset of the signals and then average within that subset, and then also you would average, for instance, the gestational age within that subset. And so you keep repeating that, and you can then look at correlations, for instance, with gestational age. And I still need to kind of, discuss with statisticians if that's a valid approach to computing a correlation. It's obviously like a very unorthodox sort of correlational analysis, but the short answer to your question is we're looking into that. Well, this is with the mother's age. So for instance, there is some evidence in the data that actually the strength of the response is correlated with the mother's age. I don't think we found anything, at least anything consistent between experiments with the gestational age of the actual fetus. But again, this is really preliminary, and I want to make sure that this is the right approach because, you know, we had to get a little bit creative to do this, given the fact that normally we are averaging across all the recordings.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand what's the link, the direct link between the SSVEP response and your conclusion about the local global, because a steady state can be in principle observed even in a dish. It's something that could be observed at very high frequencies. There's even a method called RIFT, Rapid Invisible Frequency Tagging, where basically you can stimulate very early neurons in the visual cortex, which have nothing to do with our conscious awareness of what's going on there. And it's just like basically an entrainment response of the neurons there. So I think it's one thing to demonstrate that you have like this response. And if you take a screen at 60 Hertz and you measure a response in the early visual cortex, I won't be able to see the changes on the screen at 60 Hertz, but you can record the changes by looking at so I think that this is a slightly different situation than the local global, in which basically it's at a much higher order level. So I'm just like, yeah, so for me, it's not a direct demonstration of the fact that the absence of local deviance, it should be considered as an absence of segregation of the stimuli or something like this, you see? So
yeah. So just to clarify, two things. I mean, first of all, the frequency tagging that we see is obviously not evidence per se of perceptual consciousness. That's separate. It's really just providing the context to better understand the local global work done by Moser et al., which in the right context may or may not be suggestive of perceptual consciousness, right?
This might be a bit of a jumble, but I guess I'm wondering if like you could get something like coherent hierarchical like next token prediction and have like local and global effects, but you still might be missing something like embodied simulation. So like something like a transformer like system where you're like able to like a cortical hierarchy can like do like a very sophisticated type of statistical learning and still requires and still having like you're still picking up patterns, both large and small patterns, but you're not actually having alongside it another code of or another unpacking in terms of like a stream of experience potentially, but you're still doing sophisticated statistical abstraction, like as an alternative interpretation. That may have made no sense whatsoever.
So Adam, I mean, there's definitely more sophisticated versions of this paradigm that one could implement. I think the classic local global oddball paradigm is just like, starting point. But yeah, I mean, we should definitely talk offline about more sophisticated versions of the paradigm. Yeah.
So I want to second Sid's admiration for this work.
Oh, thank you.
For the technical achievement. But I want to make a distinction, two distinctions. So, you actually gave a version of Sid's alternative in your last, I mean, you're very well aware of that alternative. But there's two questions. One is, what is the representation that the baby is using such that they notice the deviant? This involves a working memory of some sort. And this is a part of whether it's conscious. That's separate from whether it's conscious. So there's two issues, but it seems very likely that what you're many people have said this, that what you're tapping and what you suggested as an alternative interpretation, what you're tapping is some stage of sensory processing where the the four are actually being registered, like on a cochlea or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a reason to think that's the right, a reason to think that that's right is that auditory working memory for distinct sounds is a very, very individual limited, it's limited by the number of individuals. And in babies, in after-born babies, the limit is 1 or 2. So it's very unlikely that these fetuses are able to make a working memory representation of that sequence of 4 sounds. So they must be, so that's a reason to think that maybe, they're forming some representation of all 4 of them, but I loved your blurring ones. So one question is, if you do the blurring ones of the 4 different conditions, how does, do those blurry ones differ in discriminability in a way that matches that matches the pattern in the babies?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think I would want to admit that, local global is not necessarily the best measure of perceptual consciousness, even adults, much less so in fetuses. And I would also just point to the work I've done with Tim Bain, where we advocate for this cluster-based approach, where we don't think that any one of these measures per se is going to be like the marker of consciousness, right? It should be, yeah.
Great. Let's thank Dr. Frohlich.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizer for this fantastic event. This is going to be a philosophy talk, okay? Almost an epistemology one, I would say, as I am interested in exploring the potential of this type of inferential reasoning called analogical abduction, and try to explore whether this can provide justified attribution of consciousness to other entities. And specifically in this talk, we will apply analogical abduction to the question of fetal consciousness. So this leads to 2 questions. The first one is, what is analogical abduction, obviously, and we'll try to clarify this in the first half of the talk. And second, what do we mean by fetal consciousness exactly? So which stage of fetal development is relevant to consciousness science? And here I will focus on the fetus at the end of the second trimester, as I think that, as we already saw from today's talk, so this is quite interesting, both epistemically and ethically. And I will not say much about the ethical side of things. Only in the very end, I think I will try to explain how analogical abductive arguments have this sort of practical import as well. But I think that what we heard from William already kind of exemplified this point. But yeah, the focus will be on the epistemology. So what is analogical abduction? In a slogan, we can say that is abduction driven by analogy. So in an abductive reasoning, we select hypotheses given their explanatory merits, given how good of explanations they are. And we do this here with analogical abduction, but we generate this hypothesis in virtue of analogical considerations, in virtue of considerations of similarities and dissimilarities between systems. And in this paper that we have written with Liad Mudrik, we argue that analogical abduction is the best type of reasoning that we can use to build and assess arguments for justified attribution of consciousness to other entities. And our goal is to define this logical reasoning that underlies such attributions independently of the type of evidence or test for consciousness that one decides to exploit, right? So the question is not what is the evidence that justifies our attribution, but what is the logical reasoning behind the evidence that justifies the attribution. So we think of this question as a complementary and preliminary to approaches such as Jonathan Bird's theory light approach, for example, or the natural kind strategy promoted by Tim and others. Now, we suggest that the problem of other consciousnesses should be treated as an extrapolation problem, and this is a classic problem in the philosophy of science and in the sciences themselves. This is how Francesco Guala, philosopher of science, Francesco Guala defines the problem. The problem of extrapolation concerns in principle any attempt to generalize from an epistemically privileged system to a less privileged target of interest. So we call source domain the domain that is epistemically privileged, that we have studied, that we know a lot of, and target the target of interest. In our case, the source domain, as we saw today, is normally like adult humans, neurotypical adult humans, while for the purpose of this talk, the target domain will be the fetus at the end of the second trimester. Okay, so if we frame the problem of other consciousnesses in this way, we can take advantage of some of the literature in the philosophy of science about extrapolations. And we learned that there are two problems that extrapolators face when we try to jump from one domain to another. One is that we should not assume that neurotypical adult humans, in this case, are good models for target. This is what Daniel Steele, in this beautiful book on extrapolations, called the extrapolator circle. And we should determine how much difference can be tolerated by our inferential practices. And this is the problem of difference. Now, our claim is that analogical abduction is superior to the common inferential reasoning that we find, especially in the philosophical literature, which are normally inference to the best explanation, IBE, or the argument by analogy. And each of these strategies, individually taken, seem to struggle with either the extrapolator circle or the problem of difference, while analogical abduction, by combining aspects of both strategies, seems to have the resources to deal with both problems. We say has the resource in the sense that there are some issues for analogical abduction as well, especially the problem of difference does remain, but the fact that we can appeal to abductive considerations seems to put this strategy in a better position than pure analogy. So let's have a look at how it actually works, how the reasoning actually works. So here we define our source and target domain. POP stands for publicly observable properties. These can be functions, behaviors, neurobiological properties, what have you. C stands for consciousness. These are two hypotheses. And importantly, this is an explanatory connection. This arrow here between public observable properties and consciousness is a sort of explanatory model, okay, that stands in between the phenomenon and certain data set. Now, the key idea is that analogy tends to operate on relations and not on monadic properties. So what we are trying to extrapolate here from one domain to another is not just the property itself, is this explanatory relation, okay, between the observable properties and consciousness, right? So there is at this point, the abductive reasoning kind of splits into two parts. The classic IBE, the classic inference to the best explanation, is an example of a selective abduction when we already have like some hypotheses and we just pick the best. And this is actually operating here when we are already in target. But the point of analogical abduction is that we are not justified in selecting the best hypothesis in target unless we do some analogical work before. So we establish some similarities, some structural similarities across domain, and that is what justifies the formulation of the hypothesis that the target system might be conscious. All right, and only then we will be justified in asking whether we can select the conscious hypothesis over the non-conscious one. And here, ideally, we use the same tools that standard IVE uses. So technically, we need a taxonomy of explanatory virtues that tell us what good explanations should satisfy, and we should determine the best hypothesis against this comprehensive taxonomy. So given this context, we can come up with a simplified recipe for analogical abduction. So first we need to find a model that explanatorily connects consciousness with certain publicly observable properties in source. So in our case, that would be the human domain, the adult human domain, obviously. And then we need to look for relevant similarities and dissimilarities between the observable properties in source and similar observable properties in target. And finally, we need to determine whether the observable properties in target are explanatorily linked to consciousness or not, or whether instead the differences between the two domains are actually differences that make the difference with respect to the property of interest. So I will now apply this simplified recipe to the question of fetal consciousness, again, with a focus on the fetus at the end of the second trimester. So first, we need to determine a model of consciousness in neurotypical adult humans. I've heard this is not very easy to do. So for the purpose here of this talk, we can distinguish between models that are more theory-heavy, to use Jonathan Bird's phrase, or more theory-light. Here, I will just extract a sort of theory-light model that identifies only some necessary conditions and difference makers, constitutive difference makers for consciousness according to different theories of consciousness. So where there is some convergence. And the important point is that the more coarse-grained or generic the model is, the lower its justificatory force in the extrapolation process, because it might leave out important difference makers that are identifiable only at a finer grain of analysis. So low justificatory force means that we are not justified in accepting the hypothesis. At best, we can use it as a good conjecture for future studies. So now the model is just, as I said, is like a caricature of a model. It's not precise, it's not accurate. It's just for the purpose of the argument and to show how the analogical abductive reasoning works. So these are 3 points that we might want to care about if we are interested in adult human consciousness. So a lot of theories seem to suggest that thalamocortical connectivity must be established. There seems to be some convergence on the fact that this is a necessary background condition for consciousness, even if most theories of consciousness are formulated at the cortical level of analysis. Another interesting point is that feedback connectivity, recurrent connectivity, is necessary, as we heard this morning. Different theories will provide different reasons for this, obviously. And then this links to Lorina's talk this morning. There must be a balance between activity that is distributed and integrated. The brain activity must strike a balance between specialization and integration. Now, this is normally linked to IIT, integrated information theory, but this is something that, for example, the architecture of the global workspace seems to imply as well. So this seems to be compatible with the global workspace theory. And in his 2018 paper, even Victor Lamme, who's proponent of a different theory, also seem to be on board with this principle. So there seems to be some convergence on the importance of this balance for source consciousness, for adult human consciousness. So now the second step is to list the various similarities, and the similarities, I will go quickly here because we already saw most of this, thank you, most of this evidence. So we know that by week 16, we already have rapidly forming synapses. We know that we have billions of neurons that are already produced. We know this is a study that also Juan, I don't know, Juan over there also has in his poster. I guess it's a very interesting result that the overall brain connectome structure in adults and fetuses shows an organizational overlap of 61.66% that suggests important structural resemblance here. I think the mean age in the study was 33 weeks. So, or the mean is already in the third trimester, but some of the specimens were in the second trimester. So that certainly evidence that also pushes to study this structural correspondence further. And we already heard that a proto-default mode network seemed to be in place by mid-gestation, and major fibers connecting different regions begin to take form at the end of the third trimester, of the first, trimester, which might be a sign of integration. And finally, the thalamocortical connectivity seems to be almost established. Most of it is established by the end of the second trimester. But there are also important dissimilarities here. I will go quickly here because we already know this. I think the most important dissimilarity that works almost as a rebutting the fitter for the hypothesis that the fetus here is conscious is this one, right? That the development of long-range functional connectivity that is enough to break modularity and is enough to strike that balance between specialization and integration seems to develop only in the third trimester, right? So given the model we are operating with, this seems to be a piece of evidence that really pushes against the idea that the fetus at this stage is conscious. So I think that claiming that the fetus at the end of the second trimester is conscious amounts to saying that human consciousness is possible even without certain necessary difference makers. And this hypothesis seems to score lower in terms of parsimony, coherence with background knowledge than the hypothesis that the fetus is not conscious at this stage. But now, interestingly, analogical and abductive considerations are interlinked. If you take this conditional, it almost seems like a truism, right? If fetuses were more similar to neurotypical adults, then the hypothesis that they are conscious would be better, right? So how do we model this interconnection in analogical abductive reasoning? So this leads to open questions around future direction. This is mostly speculative, but it can also lead to future research. For example, I think that formal approaches to analogical reasoning, like structure preserving mapping approaches or category theory, might be used to model degrees of structural correspondence between source and target. And given the assumption that we do a good job at extracting the relevant properties, the explanatorily relevant properties in source, we might use this degree of structural correspondence as a sort of shortcut for the goodness of the hypothesis, right? The higher the degree of structural correspondence, the better the hypothesis that the target system is conscious. And finally, different degrees of structural correspondence might be mapped onto different probabilistic levels for the attribution of consciousness to the target entity. And this is important under the assumption that probability assignment to an hypothesis is driven by the goodness of the hypothesis. So hypotheses are probable because they are good, not vice versa. And this leads to the practical import of analogical abduction that I mentioned earlier, and I think it was exemplified in the previous talk as doing this sort of correspondence between abductive and analogical consideration into a probabilistic assignment leads us to try to do something like this. This is also based on Jonathan Bird's work on animal consciousness, right? So where they try to establish a probability yardstick for, probabilistic attribution of consciousness to animals in that case. And the point of doing that is that it helps translating the entire process of analogical abduction into a language that is easy to communicate, right? It helps and facilitate communications about attributions of consciousness. And I think this can be used for practical decision making and can have like practical effects. And this would establish analogical abductive arguments as a powerful tool at the juncture of epistemological and ethical issues surrounding other consciousnesses, in this case, surrounding fetal consciousness. And that's why I think this type of argument and this reasoning is worth considering and studying. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'll take a while to sort of digest it all. But your last slide that you had up, I don't know if you sort of fell down on, but where should we sit on this? Because do we go for the precautionary principle, which presumably is sort of 5% or less? Do we go for the balance of probability, the Brexit 50-50, or do we go to the beyond reasonable doubt? And because the implications, we talked about that. You talked really well about that. The elephant in the room is the political or the legal issues, and the law will want certainty on one of those three scales. And we can talk till cows come home about whether consciousness exists or not, but at some point we need to say, based on one of those sort of percentages, what the evidence should be.
Yes, I totally agree. The point is that this is the result of a complicated process that goes through all the analogical analysis, sorry for the alliteration, and the abductive procedure, and this probabilistic mapping, right? And that requires also a method to determine and quantify and formalizing structural correspondence between this domain. And we're not there yet, I guess. But you can take like a sort of heuristic shortcut and say like, well, given the model we're operating with and given the evidence, for example, in the case of fetal consciousness, we are in the lower end, we are probably in the highly unlikely, right, section, something like that. But again, that is like an heuristic shortcut. I think like a proper process would require much more than this.
Hey, thanks for your talk. So two questions, one about the relevant dissimilarity claim, and then one question that's methodological. So the relevant dissimilarity you said is something like that long-range functional there's a lack of long-range functional connectivity that indicates that like there's not a central cognition, a central processor or something. It's only modular or something at that point. But that doesn't seem right, because long-range functional connectivity is only like a heuristic for identifying something like a module. I mean, to take an example, language processing happens in lots of different areas of the brain that are quite distant from one another, yet it still may be modular. So it doesn't seem like that, this heuristic is gonna like it's not gonna prove what you think you want it to prove. And then the methodological question I have is just, why should we try to formalize or give a purely formal account of abduction when we can't give a purely formal account of confirmation theory in the first place? This seems like it would be like a problem for your view. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So about the first point, I think the idea is that the type of brain activity that is observed at this stage, it doesn't seem to be global enough to give rise to like high level of complexities that would measure that interplay of specialization and integration. I think that that would be the idea. But the second point, I think, is just a matter. Yeah, maybe it's ambitious, but it's just a matter of trying to clarify. Try to map informal reasoning into a formal or semi-formal type of reasoning that can more easily be quantified in probabilistic attributions. And I think that the benefit of doing that would probably be quite substantial. So I think it would be worth the attempt.
The literature on theories of consciousness has been dominated by a dispute between cognitive theories of consciousness, like the global workspace theory and higher order theories on one side, and sensory theories on the other, like the local recurrence and IIT, which emphasize processing in sensory areas. In the light of that dispute, the entire result that you get is based on which features of the adult consciousness you stipulated were the important ones. Yes. So you picked this long-range connectivity. That just assumes that the cognitive theories are right because they depend on long-range connectivity. The local recurrence and IIT would not require that. So I don't see that the model, the abduction and analogy models you have are doing the slightest bit of work. Everything in your result is driven by the original choice of what features of the adult to extrapolate. So I'm not.
I agree.
No, so like there is certainly like an important weight of the evidence posed on the explanatory model for sure, but that's why I went with a theory-light approach, which is supposed to try to extract different type of evidence, different type of evidence, and the idea would be try to find a consilience of evidence based from different sources, different type. And ideally, different theories should be able to account for the different type of evidence in a comprehensive manner.
Your answer to the previous question appealed to what you called complexity, which rules out modular accounts. But that is the very thing. Do you pick a feature of the adult? You call it complexity, but if it dictates long-range connectivity, then that's something that is assumed by the cognitive theory.
Well, but it's not just theory-based. It's if complexity is chosen, to be like a relevant property, is because we have extracted enough evidence, we have gathered enough evidence to say that there is like a data to phenomenon inference allowed and afforded by that type of evidence, right? So different theories will try to go and gather the evidence that will feed like into their own theories, that for sure. But we can try to do like, I believe that consciousness science goes beyond the theories of consciousness. So as a field, I think we can try to extract different models that are able to find convergence of this type of data independently of the specifics of each theory.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to be very, very briefly. So thank you for the talk. So I was wondering who is the target of the simple inference of the best explanation method that the analogical abductive arguments are trying to give a superior account. As far as I understand, the classic neurocorrelates of consciousness and inference of the best explanation that plays a role in the methodology in those cases is pretty close to what you're presenting here. So I want to just pinpoint what is the difference. So the argument goes like this. We start with behavior, observation of behaviors and brain mechanism or brain functions that correlates with consciousness in the adult case. And then from this, we isolate correlations, infer correlations between those behaviors and brain mechanism with consciousness. Once you have those correlations, we can isolate a neural marker or behavior marker, and then you see for the system, if infant or animals or AI or cerebral organoids, if the system has those neural markers or behavior markers. So correlations play already a role, and inference of the best explanation is in the very end of the argument. So what this argument is bringing to the table that is not already in the classic inference of the best explanation argument, because I don't think they work with the properties exactly.
Okay, perfect. So what's the extra ingredient of analogical abduction? So I think, so actually, let's stop here first. Partly of what you said is actually true. I believe that there are people in the literature that are already mixing the arguments from analogy and the inference to the best explanation. What we're trying to do here is try to provide an analysis for that end, like how to systematize in an argument form this merge basically between analogy and IBE. And I believe that the extra ingredient that analogical abduction brings to the table is the fact that when we operate through IBE, in this case, we are basically just observing, so like people at home can see as well, we're observing these publicly observable properties, and we just assume that there is an explanatory connection that will allow us to trace back consciousness from those properties, right? And it might be true that whatever we found in the source domain in humans is already playing some sort of analogical work here. If that's the case, I think we are already in the realm of analogical abduction. So that would be analogical abduction masked as IBE. What analogical abduction brings to the table, I believe, is that we are not really justified. Let me go back. Without the analogical process, we are not even justified in formulating this hypothesis. We're not even justified in formulating the hypothesis that the target system is conscious without certain analogical consideration. I think that's well, the missing ingredient there.
Last question.
So I guess I have a general worry about how to conceptualize analogical abduction. So your step 2 is to look for relevant similarities and dissimilarities between the publicly observable property in the source and then the analogous property in the target. But I guess I sort of worry that maybe we need a step to determine what the relevant similarities and dissimilarities are. Because I mean, maybe there are some things that we would all take as relevant regardless of our views on consciousness. But I mean, I think there's a lot of disagreement within the community of consciousness researchers about what kind of structural property or behavioral property is relevant in the first place. And so in order to, not kind of just bake in assumptions about what is relevant and what is not, I kind of wonder if maybe you need an additional step.
Yes, I totally agree. And the point is that, of course, like we can be theory driven in what the relevant properties are, but then we have the problems that Ned mentioned earlier, right? I think that it's definitely true that this second step should be is a step that comes in iteration, right? Various iterative cycles, and that's why I think it is actually compatible with the natural kind approach. As the idea is to look for, you start with the structural similarities, like independently of whether you think that those properties are explanatorily relevant or not, right? And then you start the cycle of iteration depending on which properties, and with the investigation ongoing, depending on which properties seem to be more relevant than other for the phenomenon of interest. And through cycles of iteration, you select, you identify what you consider the explanatorily relevant properties. So I totally agree that the second step is not a single step. Should not be a single step at all.
Great. Let's thank Dr. Negro.
Thank you.